Well, hello everyone. Um, Hi from Toronto Agile community. I am Ardika Karai, and with me is Peter Jakes. He's helping me uh, with all the recording and all the running behind the webinar today, as well as Paul Henman. Today, our webinar is with Chet Hendrickson. It's about the XP and what are we going to do now that it's 20 years old. So just a little bit of what's going on today. I'll introduce Chet, and then Chet is going to have a presentation and a conversation. We're going to have questions, so if you have any questions during the webinar, just put them on the question box that you have available. We're going to close up with some events, upcoming events. We have something exciting coming up. So just some housekeeping rules, just to make sure all attendees are on mute so we don't have any noises coming through the webinar. If you have any questions, as I said, in the question box, I will monitor, and I can bring those during the session. We don't have to wait all for the end. Any technical issues, just make sure you use another browser or try to log on, log off. I just went through this myself. I had to restart my machine at some point because the browser wasn't working. So figure it out. Hopefully you are now all in, but if something happens during the session. And if you have any issues with the audio, make sure that you have closed other applications in your machine. So let me introduce you. Our guest speaker today is Chet Hendrickson. You can see his picture down there, always smiley, always funny, always lovely. You very rarely see him alone. He's always pairing with Ron Jeffries. They're together like the peas in the pod, as they say, and always talking about these XP practices, always bringing new ideas and help and techniques with on development work. We owe a lot to Chet and Ron about where the development has progressed right now. So one thing to mention is our sponsors. We cannot do any of our events without your help. So thank you to everyone, all these names that you see here, for their help during our different events that we do during the year. We just had our open space, and we're setting up for the conference and these webinars and so on. Everything is to help our community to grow. So without much more of me talking, I'm just going to pass the power to Chet so he can take us through his presentation and what do we have to do after 20 years of XP?
Well, first of all, you have to figure out how to make the slides show up.
Now we can see our slides, yes.
Oh, first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to spend a little time with you. And not bothering to ask Ron, which is always good.
Well, no. Well, you are lovely. And thanks for accepting us.
Oh, well, you're more than welcome. So I was asked to do this webinar with you folks, and I had to decide something to talk about. And we've just coming upon now really the 21st anniversary, just was a couple of months ago, of the start of the first XP project at Chrysler Corporation, and this summer will be the 20th anniversary of the first major publication of the ideas of XP at the old ACM UPSLA conference. So that's kind of making me think a little bit about where XP is, where it was, where it came from, and where it might be going. When we think of XP, we think of, like I said, the XP project at Chrysler started with Kent Beck and Ron Jeffries and a bunch of us who were trying to build some software. And as we started teaching the world about XP, we mostly talked about this collection of practices. Originally, Kent spoke of 12 practices. When Ron and Ann and I wrote the pink book on XP, we broke testing into two pieces: customer testing and test-driven development for developers, giving us 13 practices. And to some extent, those practices are still valid. A lot of them are mostly still valid. And they came to be what XP was. And there was lots of discussions back around the turn of the century about how many of these practices would one have to do in order to actually say that you were doing XP and being able to mean it. And as I was thinking about where these practices came from and how we got started doing this, it turns out that Kent did not come in and say, here are these practices and we're going to do these things. He didn't even come in and say, here's a practice, we're going to do it, here's another practice, and spoon feed them to us, although that's kind of how things evolved. But he started someplace else completely. He started by talking about values. He walked into a conference room one day with us and wrote 4 words on the wall. He wrote communication, simplicity, feedback, and courage. And he said that the things we're going to do starting today are all going to be reflective of these values. And that when we come to any decision point, we're going to decide based on these values. And so I think that the future of XP starts where it began. It starts with these values of communication, simplicity, feedback, and courage. That whatever we're going to be doing going into the future has to be about thinking about these values. And so I've decided to quote me today, which is that values only matter if they change your behavior. That if you're going to do something and then decide that it aligns with your values, then those values really didn't have anything to do with that decision. That values only matter if they make you do something that you would not have done otherwise. We are not saints. Our best nature is often to maximize some return to us. And it's only when we have to do something that is a little harder, something that is a little more about something, a bigger world than us, where values are really expressed. And so let's think about and talk about a little bit about what these values are and how they should impact us going forward. The first of these values is communication. And I've got a few questions here that I've popped up on my little browser here about communication. And as I travel around the world and talk to teams and try to help them improve how they do work, one of the great questions that always comes up is, how do we do these things when I have teams that are spread around the world? And the first question I always ask them is, why do you think it's better to have your team further apart than if they were on the space station? Because the International Space Station is 250 miles up in the sky, and having team members further away than that, what are we trying to maximize there? If communication is truly one of our values, then how does having people spread across the country, or spread across the globe, or spread across the city improve that communication? And so maybe communication isn't really the value that that organization has. And maybe we should go around and start spray painting that off of the various conference rooms where they have these things written. And so I want you to think, if communication is really important to how we do business, is communication going to be important to whether we're successful or not? What would we do? Would we take people that are working together and would we spread them around the world? Or would we take people who need to work together and put them in close proximity so that they can look up and simply talk to each other, as opposed to having to go through some ritual? Now, another part of communication is that once you have some team put together, and let's imagine that they're put together in such a way that they're in close proximity, what things should we be doing to help them understand what's going on all the time? How often do you come in to where you work and discover that something's happened that you didn't know about? We developed rituals in the Agile world. We do these things called daily stand-ups, where every day people get together and talk about what's going on and what we should be doing differently and keeping up to date with what's happening around us. This is about communication. And so as we think about how are we going to move forward doing whatever sort of process we're going to be doing, we want to be thinking about how do we ensure that we have all the communication we can possibly have. How can we ensure that everything that goes on is known by everybody who needs to know it, or maybe even wants to know it? One of the great new ideas popping out in the software world is Woody Zull's notion of mob programming, where because they want to maximize communication, they have everybody sitting around a screen as the code is being written so that everybody knows everything that's happening. That's a maximization of communication. It'll be interesting to see what we think that happens. It'll be interesting to see what changes that makes in how we think about software development as more and more teams try that. But in all these ideas, we want to take the basic notion of the value and maximize as best we can using that value to make decisions about what to do. Now, the next value that Kent talked about was simplicity. And one of us, I think it was probably Ron Jeffries, who came up with the question, what is the simplest thing that could possibly work? Our goal in everything we do in the XP world is towards simplicity. At any crossroads, we always ask ourselves, is this the simplest decision we can make? Now, when we make that decision, when we decide to do the simplest thing that could possibly work, there's a bit of ambiguity because that doesn't always work. And when you're going to go down the path of doing the simplest thing that can possibly work, you have to be in a position that you can back that out occasionally, because sometimes the simplest thing that could possibly work doesn't work. It could work, but it doesn't. And so you have to be able to work in small slices that are safe so that you can step back if it turns out not to have been the simplest thing. I'm sorry, that it is not the thing that actually worked. Now, one of the big ideas impacting us today in the Agile world is this notion of scaling. And I see more and more organizations who are working as hard as they can to plug in huge mechanisms into their workplace to allow them to scale. And I recoil at that because one of my values is simplicity. And I believe that scaling has to be no more complex than the base process we're using. If doing a big project requires 3 times as much mechanism as doing a small project, then I don't think we're doing it right. that simplicity requires us to start with the simplest thing that could possibly work and only add process when we have real feedback telling us we need that. In the same sort of way that test-driven development tells us to start with the least code possible and then only add code when we have a test that will fail unless that code exists. We should always be thinking about how to make our processes simpler, how to make our code simpler, how to make all the things we do as simple as possible. The world is a very complex place, and you're not going to succeed by using complexity to try to solve a complex problem. The only way you can solve a complex problem is with simplicity. And so we want to drive towards always doing the simplest thing that could possibly work. Now, sometimes that's not as simple as we'd like it to be, but we have to get to work. We have to make it work. Now, the third of XP's 4 values was feedback. And feedback is a really difficult value to hold, because feedback is really about hearing things you don't want to hear. I'd like to believe that whatever I do is good, that it makes me happy. Certainly having feedback from myself is important, but I am not the totality of my audience. And so feedback from others is vitally important, and we have to learn how to hear that feedback in a way that helps us improve. We have to learn how to give feedback in a way that helps others improve. XP is really driven by this notion of feedback. Agile is really driven by this notion of feedback. Scrum is really all about creating feedback to decide what to do later on. And to the extent that Scrum and XP are mostly the same set of ideas, just said different ways, we're really all about feedback, about listening to what's going on, about doing small, safe fail experiments, and deciding based on the outcome of those what to do going forward. I think all of our projects we do should be mostly a set of experiments to help us understand what to do going forward. Now, these 3 values that I've spoken about very quickly, apparently this thing's not going to take very long. The 3 values that I've spoken about are really driving us to the 4th value. And the 4th value, I think, is the one that is probably most misunderstood and is really the richest of all the things that XP has brought to us, and that is courage. Kent spent an awful lot of time talking to us about courage, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about courage as a value as we move forward. We made an explicit point that the courage is not about acting in a foolhardy manner. Courage is not jumping off a cliff. That's just stupid. But if you have a parachute, if you somehow have magic boots that you know will save you, then jumping off a cliff is not that bad an idea. That we only want to do things when we have enough information to tell us what the outcome is likely to be. And in software development, in the ideas that we're talking about today, not just in this webinar, but in the general community, it's about working in such a way to give us courage. There's a big hullabaloo going on in the software world today, starting this weekend, about a hack in the UK, where the National Health Service's computers have been attacked, and apparently computers across a wide range of the world have been attacked by malware. Those folks administering those systems may have had courage that they believed their systems were secure, but that courage was not based on reality. We should have courage because we know that what we're doing is going to work, or at the very least we know that if what we're doing isn't going to work, we have before us the tools and the techniques that will allow us to get back to a safe place quickly and easily and safely. Even back at the Chrysler project, we got to a point where we were pushing code to production multiple times a week. Our goal today in the DevOps kind of world is to have just a continuous pipeline of new features that are created and that are known to be good in such a way that we have the courage to simply push those forward. And as you go back and think about all the stuff you have to do to move to that kind of world, to be in a position to push changes out to the final customer every day, what kind of things do we have to know? What kind of tools have to be in place? What kind of verifications have to be in place to allow us to do those sorts of things? What would it take to do that every time somebody commits? To simply push that all the way. What would it take for us to have the courage to do that? Not the stupidity to do that, but the courage to do that. What would it take for us to do that every time we get a green bar in our testing, to push that code all the way out into the hands of the customers? Well, we would have to work in such a way that we would know that every time we did that, the world would be getting better, that we would never ever break anything, that we would have knowledge about the impact of the changes we make. And that knowledge gives us courage. Courage comes from knowledge, not from hope, not from desire, but from knowledge. And so as we think about where we want to be 20 years from now in this path about XP, I think these 4 values have to drive those ideas. That it's about always doing things which enhance our communication. Always doing everything to be as simple as we can be. To build processes, to build products whose underlying architectures, to build features that the usage of them are so simple that they drive us forward. Communication, always knowing what's going on, everybody on the team always knowing what's going on, and what would it take for that to actually be true. To have the courage and the foresight to understand that the feedback we get is important and know how to bring that in. To have enough knowledge to give us courage to always be moving forward. That the XP values, I think, drive in a rational way where we should be going. For some reason, I thought this would take a whole lot longer to say than it is.
That's
okay. I had
okay.
the courage to speak very quickly.
That's okay. We have questions.
I see we have questions popping up, and it seems like half of them are for people who I know, and so I am happy to talk to anybody about anything they'd like to talk about. Otherwise, we'll all go have lunch. So
we'll start with one. We'll start with one of the questions that JB brought up. So he says the values all seem to relate very closely to managing risk. So is communications to make risks explicit, simplicity to reduce risk of jumping to overcomplicated solutions, feedback to help us see risk becoming problems, a quest for courage can drive us to manage risks better. So is XP an awesome risk management system? Or do I just treat risk management as a golden hammer?
Well, thanks for that lovely question, Joe. and it's good to hear from you. You know, Ron likes to say that risk is the water in which the agile fish swims. Everything we do in XP, and really everything a real agile process does, is about risk. If you think about the primary risks we have in any sort of product development, the biggest risk we have in product development is we will have spent all the money and used up all the time, and we don't have anything. I've been on projects like that, where we spent all the money and all the time and we didn't have anything. And that's bad. And so most of traditional project management is about dealing with that. We believe you're spending our money and our time wisely because you filled out these forms and you had these gate reviews and you did all this stuff. Now it turns out that's not a horrible idea. The only real problem with it is it doesn't work. And so you think about what we do in XP and what we do in Scrum, and that is at the end of every few weeks, we have a version of our product. XP calls for short, quick release cycles, frequent releases, because if you release frequently, you mitigate the risk of having not built anything, because you can see that we are building stuff going all along. The second big risk we have in software development is we will spend all the time and all the money and we will have built something, but it isn't what they want. And here again, we build our product in this incremental fashion so that we can get frequent feedback to know whether we're building the right product or not. We have risks within our team about architecture, and we do things in the XP way in order to mitigate those risks. We have risks about people and losing knowledge, and so we share that knowledge within the XP so that we mitigate those risks. And so, yes, I think you hit the nail exactly on the head, that everything we do really in XP is about risk and limiting those risks in a concrete way, not in a way that's just about writing documents, but actually removing the thing at the bottom where that risk comes from.
Nice to put another name beside XP, the golden hammer.
Well, I don't know that I would. A golden hammer, huh? You'll have to tell me more about that.
That's what Joe called it.
Oh.
Everything is a nail, he says.
Everything is a nail. Well, you know, not everything is a nail, but there sure are a lot of nails out there, and we tend to step on them.
Mm-hmm. But hammer is not the only tool we have, right?
It's certainly not. It's certainly not.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to continue on some other questions that we have here.
Okay.
Shah is asking, is courage the only real value? And all the others supporting it. It seems from a grammatic point of view to be so.
I think there's truth in that. I think there's truth in that. You can derive interesting things from the four values, but if you think about courage being the primary one, that if you have real courage based on knowledge and your ability to predict for a very, very short time the future, everything else serves that, at least in my mind. So yes, I think there's truth in that.
Okay. Then the next one is from Patricia. How do clients manage continuous delivery from a training and uptake perspective?
Well, that is a difficult issue sometimes. It matters a lot about how we have constructed our product. You know, I think it's a lovely time in our industry where we have to we're in a position where we have to confront those challenges. When I first started building software 30-some years ago, it seemed that our process was that we would release code to our customers unless we could prove it didn't work. And today, I think one of the things that XP has taught us is to release a product, release code to our customers once we can prove it works. And so we've eliminated, through good technical practice, I think, a lot of the reason not to release a code, because that fear of giving somebody something that doesn't work we have ways of mitigating those, at least. We have not eliminated them, but we have ways of mitigating those. And so that allows us to start thinking about the question that she just had, which was, how do I keep my customers, my end users, in a position where they can continue to take advantage of the features that I am adding? And that, I think that's a major challenge. We have to think about how I can structure my products so that training is minimized, that they become more tolerant of our individual users' desires. Most products get built based on someone's one single idea about how something should work, and maybe we should provide multiple paths so that our customers, our clients, our users get to discover how to use a tool in the way that works best for them. I think that's a big challenge. I think that's a big challenge, and not one that I certainly have a whole lot of answers to. But I think the good thing is that we're in a position where that might be our biggest problem, as opposed to the situation we used to live in, which is we would send a new release to our customers and they would age it for a week or two to make sure that we don't call them up in a panic and tell them not to install that new release. And I think that's a whole lot better world to be in, is having a training issue, not a quality issue.
Mm-hmm. Am I hearing you right? You're touching sort of like in designing and in user experience areas here. Have XP practices help with user experience, creating a better way of understanding the clients with the support of the XP practices? Or am
I think you're right. Now, I will preface any discussion I have about user usage and usage design and user experience by saying that 35 years ago, I created really awful user interface in CICS and IMS-DC. And then I learned to make really awful user interface in PowerPoint, and then I learned to make really awful user interface in Smalltalk, and now I can make really awful user interface in any of the modern tools we have today. I am the guy who believes that the fields on the screen should be the order in which they appear in the database schema. and so I am not I'm not the guy talking about user interface. But I think that the XP world has brought two ideas that help us in that area. One of them is this notion of whole team. One of the practices of XP is whole team. Scrum says the same thing. Scrum says that your development team should have all the skill required to build the product. And today, one of those skills is user experience engineering. That having people on your team who, if they're not user experience engineers, have knowledge of that skill, so that we can build our products in such a way that we can that our users can understand how to use them and will want to use them. Another thing, going back to our notion of frequent release, is that it gives us opportunities to evolve those user interactions, those user experiences, to be better and better as we go down the road. And if you back that up with high quality engineering practices so that there is very clean separation between user experience and implementation of the actual business logic, then it becomes much easier to replace those user experiences with better ones without major rewriting of the underlying systems. One should be able to build your software so that you could throw away the user interface and replace it without making any changes to the code beyond the public API, really.
Okay, so what are the mechanisms that you can use to reinforce the XP values?
Reinforcing values is really a team exercise that at the end of every iteration, you guys should be spending a little bit of time talking about what's going on. Scrum calls this a retrospective, and in fact, that is what they are, retrospectives. You do things to bring these values to the forefront. You ensure that when somebody makes a decision that is counter to these values, that we stop and we talk about it. And you don't have to wait to the end of the iteration to do that. You don't have to wait to the end of the sprint to do that. You can stop right now. We have to own these values as a team. And they can't be just words on a wall. They have to be ideas in your heart. And you have to model those ideas, these values, and you have to make hard decisions doing things that are not the thing you'd like to do, but that supports your values. And if you have a team that is reasonably mature, where everybody on the team is a leader, that has the opportunity to be a leader, then the team will learn that these values are important, and they'll start making decisions based upon what these values are. The quickest way to take any sort of values and turn them into just words on the wall is to not model them, to not make decisions based upon them. It's difficult. We would much prefer to have a simple set of rules. You do this, you do that, you do this other thing. And that leads us to a cargo cult sort of approach. You know, how many places have you gone where they say, yes, we're doing Scrum because every day at 10 o'clock we have a phone call with each other? And everybody sits there on mute till it's their turn to talk, and then they say there's 4 things they did yesterday, and then they go back to doing whatever they were doing. That isn't communication. That isn't a whole team. That's something else. And you have to decide as a team that these are your values. It's okay to have other values, as long as you all know what they are and you all agree that they're your values. These are XP's values. I think they're good. I think they're important. But you don't have to do them. But whatever your values are, you should have the courage to stand up and say that these are our values, and when we make a decision, they are reflective of these values.
Okay. Geraldine also is going back to the risk mitigation. She's asking what are the best ways to mitigate risk.
Well, first of all, the first thing you have to do when you're moving into the realm of risk mitigation is understand what that risk is. One of the interesting things that Kent taught us was that all process is a reaction to fear. And you really need to know what it is you're afraid of. And so the first step in any move in risk mitigation is is understanding what that risk is. And the risk may not be what everybody says. And so you probably need to go down some root cause analysis to understand why we believe this risk exists and what is the impact of this risk. What is it we're trying to avoid? Because having risk associated with avoiding some outcome that is trivial is maybe not worth the effort. That we want to know that the outcome we're trying to avoid is important to avoid. And so I would always start with understanding what the risk is, why are we afraid of that thing, what is the impact of that thing, and what short cycle experiments can we do to cause that risk to not be something we need to worry about anymore. What information can we put in the hands of people to show them that is not something we need to worry about? There are risks out there, and a lot of them will kill us, and we have to act on those things to discover what will stop us from turning into zombies. You know, I've been on a few projects in my life that were zombie projects, that, you know, they were dead, but they didn't know it yet. And we want to avoid that. We want to know the thing that's going to kill us, and we want to do something about that early. XP has this thing called a spike, which is a lovely phrase, a lovely term made up by Ward Cunningham, borrowed from that big long nail that holds the gutter to your house, a gutter spike. And the idea is that when I have some technical issue or either some other kind of issue, I want to go off and I want to do an experiment, a safe fail experiment that is rigidly time-boxed to address that. One of our biggest challenges back at the beginning of the XP project, the C3 project, actually after release, was speed. We were paying our 10,000 people on our lovely big Sun server with 12 CPUs and 250 megabytes of RAM, and it took us, I believe, about 10 hours to pay everybody. And we paid them once a month, and it wasn't that big a deal. But eventually we were supposed to pay 100,000 people once a week. And so our customer, Marie's boss's boss, would come in every couple weeks and ask us how long it took to run the payroll. And we would tell him, and he would go, "Oh, that's kind of a long time, isn't it?" And so after a few cycles of this, we kind of got the idea that he was thinking we should speed the thing up. And so we did lots of little things around the edges to improve performance. And then one day we had an idea that what we should do is, instead of paying one person at a time, we should split the system up and basically pay people in parallel, because paying me had nothing to do with how Rich was paid or Joe was paid.
Mm-hmm.
And so me and another one of our developers, Dave Bryant, went off for half a day, and we figured out how to multi-thread our application. We didn't do it really, we just hacked together some code to figure out how long it would take to do, figure out if it was possible to do. And then we came back and we said, we think it'll take a week to do this. And if we do this, we think we'll get about this kind of performance improvement, because we can take, since we have 12 CPUs, we can actually pay maybe 10 or 12 people at the same time, and therefore get a reduction in execution speed pretty much commensurate with that.
Mm-hmm.
And so the next time Joe, who was our customer's boss's boss, came in and asked Marie, our customer, how long the payroll ran, she told him how long it ran, and she said, and we know how to fix it, and it'll take a week to do, and it'll get this kind of improvement. And so that whole big piece of risk went away, not because we'd actually done the work, but because we had figured out what the answer was with a high enough confidence that we could tell people what it was. And so an iteration or two later, Marie brought us a user story in our planning session that said, do that thing that Dave and Chet came up with to speed up the payroll, which is what a user story should sound like. And Dave and I said, oh, we know how to do that. It'll take us about 5 days to do. And we went off and did it. And the next time the payroll ran, it took 40 minutes. And so you do these experiments to give you the courage to know that that problem is no longer a risk. So it goes back to courage. The courage is knowing how to eliminate those risks. Now maybe you've not eliminated them yet, but if you know how to do it and you know what it'll cost to do it, then it no longer is a risk. It just becomes something to set on the wall until it's time to do, until it becomes the most important thing for us to do next.
Okay. We're going to have room for a couple of more questions that are waiting. Another one is saying, have any of the practices that you like or liked has aged badly as the constraint related to delivering software as a business have changed? Are there any XP practices or principles that you find quaint or old-fashioned nowadays?
There is, and it happened incredibly quickly. One of the original XP practices, which was actually one of my favorites, was something called metaphor. And the idea behind metaphor was that we would create a language within your team to describe how we were building the product. And that system of words would be used within the team, talking to the technical between the technical folks and with the business folks to understand how we were going about building this product. And it turns out that metaphor did not last. That either we were not very good at explaining to people how to use metaphor, or that it was something that was not particularly necessary. And so metaphor has sort of gone away. Some of them have changed a little bit. Sustainable pace, I see on my list. When we first started doing XP, we didn't talk about sustainable pace. We talked about no overtime, because we felt overtime was a symptom of other kinds of problems, and so we wanted to eliminate the things that caused us to have to work overtime.
Okay.
And we knew that overtime reduced quality, and so we've morphed though from overtime into sustainable pace. I happen to still like no overtime as a set of ideas. I believe that software developers should have solar-powered workstations, and when it gets dark, they have to go home. And I always had a different definition of overtime. I believe that overtime is having to be at the office when you really just don't want to be. And so I've had jobs where 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning I was working overtime, and I've had other situations where I wanted to go into work on Sunday and my wife had to keep me from doing it, and it would not have been overtime. But I think other than metaphor and a little bit of morphing in sustainable pace, they all pretty much hold up. We've changed, I think, a little bit about what we mean about some of these things. Certainly, small releases has changed.
Okay.
The first release of C3 took 11 sprints, took 11 iterations, 33 weeks to get us to a point where we could release. Today, I think we would all agree that that's way too long, and we would want to figure out how to work in such a way that a small release would have come after just a few weeks. Now, by the time we were a couple years into it, small releases meant probably once or twice a week. But we want to push all those things as far as we can.
Okay, thanks. We have about 5 minutes left, and we have two questions. So I'm going to read them both because they kind of complement each other and they kind of touch on each other. So Frank is asking, you spoke about mob programming, which sounds like an extension to the practice of pair programming. What are your thoughts on how the rest of the 13 practices will evolve over time and the addition of any new practice? And then Uzair is following up on the pair programming, and he's asking, can you comment on pair programming practices and whether you still hold the opinion that it is a better practice on XP that encourages communication, or whether you feel this can still be achieved without pairing?
I don't know any way of getting what pair programming gives you. And the only modification I would make in my work would be to expand how big that pair is. And so I mostly work with one other guy, Ron, and so our mob programming is really two people, and therefore it's pair programming because that's all we have.
You're the mob.
We're the mob. I said that we don't actually do mob programming. We do rabble programming because we're not as organized as a mob. But I'm I believe you could probably interject here that you recently saw Ron and I give a keynote address at the AATC in which we pair programmed.
Right. The keynote.
Yeah. So while we were giving the keynote, and so yes, I believe that pair programming or more people involved is a really good practice. Now, I don't know what the limits of it are, and Woody Zuhl, the father of mob programming, refuses to put a limit on how big your mob should be. There may be a practical limit. You may not want 40 people mob programming. But I hear occasionally of people who were doing mob programming sessions that were larger than I would have thought sustainable and ethical. Now, pair programming is an interesting idea. Back 15 or 20 years ago, if I had shown up at your location to talk about software development practice, I would have talked a lot about pair programming and told you that you really have to do this. Today, I've learned that mostly doesn't work as a sales technique. In our training, we teach people how to do it. And we say, learn how to do this technique, and if you find it helps you, then you should do it. Mm-hmm. But if you find it doesn't help you, then don't do it. But you should make that decision after having learned how to do it. Mm-hmm. Now, all the research that exists, going back in one form or another, probably back 40 or 50 years, is that two software developers working independently or two software developers working two software developers working independently will produce slightly more code than two programmers working together. Slightly more code. But the quality of the code developed by the pair will be much higher. And so if you drive to the same level of quality, you will get there faster pairing, or at least no slower than pairing. Mm-hmm. And when you get to the end of the day, you'll have two people who actually know what's happening as opposed to one. Mm-hmm. You will have two people who have worked on the code in such a way that it could be understood, perhaps, than one developer who just certainly made something work. The experiments that Arlo Belcher has done in promiscuous pairing, where swapping pairs every hour and a half or so, he found to be the most efficient way, so that by the end of the day, everybody has seen everything. Mm-hmm. It certainly causes us to drive communication as far forward as possible. Mobbing is a way of valuing communication quite highly, because if you have the whole team sitting around looking at how the code is being written, and contributing to how the code is being written, then you're saying that communication is really valuable to us. And maybe we're willing to give up a little bit of speed because we value communication more than speed. Mm-hmm. Now, it may be that you don't actually give it very much. We're pretty early in this, and we don't have enough rigor in our experimentation to know if how big that group should be. Is 2 enough, or should it be 4 or 6 or 10? And at what point do we start to drop off? And we were better off having 2 mobs of 6 instead of 1 mob of 12. These things we don't know yet, and hopefully we'll figure those things out, because it's an interesting thing. You know, like all this stuff, the first time you hear it, you ought to think that's crazy, and then you ought to dig in a little bit and understand why it makes sense and where might you use it and where might you not use it. Like all these practices. Yeah. There are places I don't do test-driven development because it's not worth the effort. And there's other places where I would not want to be in a place that did not test drive this kind of stuff. So all these things are implementations of those practices. We think about how can I get that practice installed, and I'm sorry, how we get that value installed in such a way that the practice supports the value, and we're not just doing the practice for the sake of the practice.
You said one thing that I believe everyone now wants to hear. There might be a case where TDD might not make sense. We have 1 minute. Can you just bring one of those cases?
Well, mostly there are things that I don't know how to do. With
so TDD. Experimenting?
So it's some experimenting. You know, there's certainly a lot of work on user interface that I don't know how to do in a TDD-driven way. Mm-hmm. I like the technique. Now, I know we could. I would suggest you bring Joe Raines Bergeron in to talk about some of that, because you know Joe has been pushing back a little bit against TDD, and I'd love to hear what he's saying about that. I think mostly it's because he's found ways that might be even better, and I think that's wonderful. All the practices are the best ideas we had 20 years ago, and I keep hoping people will find better things to do. And one of the things I really hate about Joe Raines Bergeron is he's really smart.
He's been our first presenter on our series of webinars.
I'll go back and listen to it then.
He's in our neighborhood.
Yeah, I know. That's the problem with Joe, is he's smarter than I am, and he comes up with better ideas than I do.
Oh, no.
At least every now and then.
No. Well, you know what? I'm gonna probably put you both on our Twitter and continue this conversation there, because it sounds like there's more to talk about. But we're running out of time here, so I'm gonna take control.
Okay.
And I want to thank you again for this lovely conversation. And I think, looking back, you did exactly what XP does. You start with the simplest thing that work. You had only the stories that you wanted to tell us, those 4 values, and then everything evolved from there. So perfect example, start with the simplest thing and then add into that.
I hope so.
Thank you for that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being asked.
All right. And for everyone that is still with us and is interested on what's going on in our community, we are very happy to announce that Toronto Agile Conference is now November 7. Our keynote speaker is Joshua Kirievsky, and he will talk on modern Agile. The website is up to date. We have all the information there, and this is now our next big thing. Stay tuned for submissions. All of you that are interested to bring your talks, your conversations, your experiences to our conference, we're going to open the submissions soon, so feel free to start submitting. Registrations will open later in the summer, and we really want to hear your feedback, either for this topic that we had today or future topics that you are interested. So stay in touch with us, follow us either on Twitter or on our website. And that was it for today. Thank you everyone that joined us, and thank you, Chet, very much for your